Hi, thanks for joining me today. This is Matthew. Today, I'm going through the story of two men who mocked the caution of their Sherpas during a live stream and insisted they could judge the risks for themselves. They would achieve the goal they had spent years chasing, but neither of them would leave that mountain ever again. It was May 17th, 2019. Mount Everest sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet at 8,849 meters above sea level, the highest point on Earth. The South Col route on the Nepal side is the most traveled path to the summit, winding through glaciers, ice falls, and high mountain camps above the clouds. Emmerich Pendleton was a 34-year-old fitness entrepreneur from Denver. He had gained a loyal online following by sharing content about training, discipline, and self-improvement, and believed that enough preparation could overcome almost any challenge. After climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and completing a winter ascent of a Colorado 14er, he set his sights on Everest, documenting the journey as the next step in a goal he had been pursuing for years. He trained hard, did his research, and believed he was ready. But Everest above 8,000 meters isn't just a test of fitness. It's a test of physiology, and no amount of training can fully prepare the body for that altitude. And his gym friend, Phelan Thaddeus, was 31. A former competitive powerlifter, he had followed Emmerich into mountaineering over the previous 2 years, joining him on several smaller climbs. He was also the person behind much of their content, helping film and document the Everest expedition. More than anyone, Phelan believed the summit could be a breakthrough moment for both of their careers. He was quieter than Emmerich, but just as confident, and often viewed warnings from others as a reflection of their own limits rather than the challenge itself. Neither man had been above 6,000 meters before this expedition, and to be fair, that's not as unusual as it sounds. Everest attracts people from all kinds of backgrounds, and plenty arrive with far more experience in other environments than they have at extreme altitude. Everest had been Emmerich's goal from the beginning, but Phelan played a major role in turning it into a reality. After Kilimanjaro, Emmerich began talking about Everest, first as a distant goal and then as a serious plan as his mountaineering content gained traction online. Phelan saw the potential immediately. Within a few months, they had signed on with a commercial expedition operator, secured a pair of sponsorships, and started building the story they would share with their audience from training to summit. The training over the next 18 months was serious. Altitude simulation mask, weighted hikes at elevation, cold exposure, VO2 max testing, structured training blocks. Emmerich shared nearly all of it online. The results were impressive, and by the time they left for Kathmandu in late March 2017, he was in the best shape of his life. Kathmandu was the first place the dynamic between the two men and the world around them became visible. They had arrived expecting a logistical hub, a place to sort gear, meet the expedition team, and move through efficiently. What they found was a city that operated entirely on its own terms, and neither of them adjusted to that easily. Phelan filmed constantly, the streets, the markets, the equipment shops, the other expedition members. He framed everything as backdrop, the city itself, the people in it, the culture around them. All of it appeared in the content as texture rather than substance. The pre-expedition briefing with the operator took place over 2 days and covered acclimatization protocols, emergency procedures, oxygen management, and the role of the Sherpa team. Emmerich listened and asked reasonable questions about the physical demands of each section. When the operator's representative explained the acclimatization rotation schedule, the series of up and down climbs between base camp and the higher camps that the body required before the summit push, Emmerich asked how much flexibility existed in the timeline. The representative said very little. Emmerich nodded and moved on, but Phelan noted the answer and filed it away as something to revisit later. The gear check flagged 2 items: lighter gloves than recommended and a sleeping bag rated to a temperature that was borderline for Camp 4 conditions. Emmerich said he ran warm and had tested the gloves in Colorado winters. The representative replaced the gloves without further discussion. It was a small moment, but it was the first of many where someone with more experience tried to make a correction and got pushback instead of acknowledgement. The trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp takes approximately 9 days and gains nearly 3,000 meters of elevation. It is not technically demanding, but it is the first real test of how a person responds to altitude, and it is where the Sherpa team begins forming their assessments of the clients they are going to take up the mountain. Their lead Sherpa, who had summited Everest 6 times and had been working with commercial clients for over a decade, met them at Lukla. He was quiet, precise, and had read both men within the first 2 days of walking. Emmerich was strong and moved well on the trail. Phelan was also strong, but had a tendency to push the pace on uphill sections in a way that experienced high-altitude guides recognized immediately as the wrong instinct, burning energy to prove a point rather than conserving it for what was ahead. It's a pattern at this point. The fitter someone is, the harder it can be for them to accept that fitness isn't the currency that matters up here. The friction began around Dingbosch at approximately 4,400 meters, where the standard itinerary includes a rest day for acclimatization. Emmerich felt fine and said so. Phelan said the rest day felt unnecessary, given how well both of them were moving. Their lead Sherpa explained that feeling fine at 4,400 meters was not the relevant measure. The body's adaptation to altitude happened during rest, not during movement, and skipping rest days at this stage created deficits that compounded at higher elevations. Emmerich accepted this. Phelan filmed the explanation and posted it with a caption that was technically neutral, but carried a tone his audience understood. They reached Everest Base Camp at 5,364 meters on April 9th. Base Camp in the spring season is a small city of tents spread across the Khumbu Glacier. Dozens of expedition teams, hundreds of people, a constant low-level noise of wind and equipment, and conversation in multiple languages. For most climbers arriving for the first time, the scale of what they have committed to becomes suddenly and physically real when they can look up and see the mountain above them. Emmerich's response was to film it extensively and post a long video about the mental preparation required to stand at the bottom of Everest and commit to going up. It was one of his better pieces of content, honest about the weight of the moment, specific about the physical reality ahead. Phelan's response was more practical. He spent the first 2 days organizing camera equipment, testing battery performance in the cold, and working out the logistics of how they were going to document the climb. Their lead Sherpa conducted the first formal team briefing on their second day at base camp. He covered the rotation schedule, the oxygen system, the turnaround protocol, and the emergency procedures in detail. He was unhurried and specific. When he reached the section on turnaround time, 2 p.m. at the absolute latest on summit day, regardless of position on the mountain, Phelan asked whether that was a hard rule or an operator guideline. The Sherpa said it was a hard rule based on oxygen reserves, weather window timing, and the documented pattern of deaths on the mountain occurring overwhelmingly during descents that began too late. Phelan said he understood. He also established something at that briefing that both men heard but didn't fully absorb, that the Sherpa team were not support staff. They were the most experienced people on the mountain. They had been on this route more times than any client in the group, and their assessments of conditions and risk were not suggestions. The first acclimatization rotation took them from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at approximately 6,100 meters. The Icefall is a moving glacier riddled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers, navigated via aluminum ladders laid horizontally across gaps and fixed ropes running through the most dangerous sections. It requires crampons, precise footwork, and the ability to move efficiently while clipped to a rope with a heavy pack. At altitude, it is not the most technically demanding section of the climb, but it is the most objectively dangerous. Seracs and entire sections of ice can collapse without warning, and the route through it changes constantly as the glacier moves. Emmerich moved through it well. He was careful and methodical, and responded to the technical demands without the ego that sometimes caused stronger climbers to rush sections they should have taken slowly. Phelan struggled more than either of them had expected. The ladder crossings over the deeper crevasses required a specific kind of calm that his powerlifting background had not prepared him for. The exposure was different from anything he had trained for, and his pace through the icefall was noticeably slower than Emmerich's. He didn't say anything about it. Emmerich didn't either. Their lead Sherpa noted it and said nothing. The second rotation took them to Camp 2 at 6,400 meters, and then up toward Camp 3 at 7,200 meters. This was where the altitude began to separate the two men more clearly. Emmerich continued to perform within expected parameters, slower than at sea level, more effortful, but functional and controlled. Phelan developed a persistent headache above 7,000 meters, and his appetite dropped significantly. Both are recognized early symptoms of acute mountain sickness, and their lead Sherpa flagged them directly. He recommended that Phelan descend to Camp 2 for a rest day. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable, and Emmerich backed him up. The Sherpa made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign, not something to push through, but he wasn't going to force the decision. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next day, he took it as proof that the concern had been unnecessary. He recommended that Phelan descend from Camp 3 to Camp 2 for a rest day before continuing. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable and said he got headaches all the time at sea level. Emmerich agreed that he knew his own body. The Sherpa didn't force the issue, but he made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign that shouldn't be ignored. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next 24 hours, he took it as proof that the Sherpa had been overly cautious. What it actually meant was that his body was struggling to adapt to the altitude. Neither of them understood that at the time, and there was no way to make them. During that second rotation, a weather system moved in faster than forecast, and their lead Sherpa called a rest day at Camp 2. No movement toward Camp 3. Wait for conditions to stabilize. It was the correct call. The wind above Camp 2 was strong enough to make upward progress dangerous, and the energy cost of fighting it at that altitude had a recovery cost measured in days. Emmerich and Phelan were frustrated. They had been at Camp 2 for 2 days already, and the delay felt unnecessary from inside the tent, where the wind was audible but the sky above them looked manageable. Every day of delay was a day of content they weren't producing, and a day closer to the weather window closing. Phelan set up the camera. The video they recorded that afternoon was not a rant. It was calm, articulate, and framed as a candid update for their audience. Emmerich talked about the delay and suggested that some people on the mountain had spent so many years operating in a culture of caution that they struggled to recognize when conditions were actually acceptable. He said the Sherpas were incredibly valuable for logistics, route knowledge, and carrying loads. But that experience and expertise were not always the same thing. He argued that the people attempting the climb should ultimately be making the decisions, not the people hired to support it. He also said that he and his friend were capable of evaluating the conditions for themselves and didn't intend to hand over that responsibility to anyone else. Phelan added that the delay felt calibrated to the Sherpas' comfort level rather than the conditions themselves. He said there came a point where climbers had to trust their own assessment of the mountain. Instead of treating every recommendation as unquestionable, they brought the memory card down to base camp at the end of the rotation. Phelan edited the clip, compressed it, and uploaded it through the expedition's satellite terminal at base camp, the only place on the mountain with the bandwidth to support a video upload. It went live to their audience 3 days later. Their lead Sherpa saw the video on a phone that evening. Another member of the team had found it and shown it to him without comment. He watched it once, said nothing, and continued preparing the equipment for the next rotation. He did not raise it with either man directly, and I think that restraint, that choice to say nothing and just keep doing the job, says more about who he was than anything else in this story. After the rotations were complete, both men returned to base camp for a 4-day rest period before the summit push. On the third rest day, their lead Sherpa sat with both men for the summit briefing. He went through the plan in full: departure time from Camp 4, oxygen flow rates for each section, the turnaround rule, the signs of deterioration to watch for in each other, and the protocol if either of them became unable to move under their own power above Camp 4. He was specific and unhurried, and he did not soften any of it. He told them the weather window for their push was narrow. A system was forecast to arrive from the west within 36 to 40 hours of their planned departure from Camp 4. That meant the timing had almost no margin. They needed to move efficiently, they needed to respect the turnaround time, and they needed to be back at Camp 4 before the system arrived. Any significant delay at any point in the push compressed the margin further. He also told them that the headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation was something he had not forgotten, and that Phelan needed to be honest about how he was feeling at every stage of the push. If something felt wrong above 8,000 meters, correct response was to say so immediately, not to manage it privately. The summit push was scheduled to begin from Camp 4 on the evening of May 17th. They left Camp 4, the South Col, at 7,950 meters at 10:30 p.m. on May 17th. The conditions at departure were within acceptable parameters: cold, dark, wind at manageable levels, visibility adequate. Their lead Sherpa went first. A second Sherpa followed behind Phelan, who was the slower of the two. The section from Camp 4 to the balcony at approximately 8,400 meters took 4 hours and 30 minutes, longer than the standard 3 to 4 hours, primarily because of Phelan's pace. He was moving but not efficiently. His footwork was delivered in a way that suggested he was working harder than the altitude alone accounted for. Their lead Sherpa slowed the group somewhat to match him, which compressed the timeline by approximately 45 minutes against the plan. At the balcony, the lead Sherpa checked both men's oxygen. Emmerich was on track. Phelan had consumed slightly more than projected due to the extended time on the lower section. The flow rate was adjusted marginally, and the deficit was noted. The margin was tighter than it should have been, and they hadn't even reached the hardest section yet. They continued upward. The section from the balcony to the south summit at 8,690 meters took another 5 hours and 40 minutes, far slower than expected. Phelan's pace had dropped noticeably, and his movements and responses were becoming less precise. He was still functioning, but something was clearly wrong. They reached the south summit at 9:20 a.m. on May 18th. Their lead Sherpa stopped the group and told them they needed to turn around. He explained the situation calmly. The summit was still at least 45 minutes away. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast, and Phelan had already used more oxygen than planned. Just as concerning was his condition. After hours in the death zone, he was showing signs that his body was no longer coping with the altitude the way it needed to. Emmerich said they were 45 minutes from the summit. He said they had been on the mountain for 6 weeks, had done everything correctly, and were standing at 8,690 meters. He said he was not turning around 45 minutes from the top. Their lead Sherpa said he was not, asking them to abandon the expedition. He was telling them that, continuing from this point, given Phelan's condition and the oxygen situation and the incoming weather, significantly reduced the probability of both of them getting back down. Phelan said he felt fine. His legs were heavy, but that was expected and he could manage it. Emmerich looked at him, then looked at the Sherpa and said they were continuing. Their lead Sherpa said he was formally advising against it and that he wanted that noted. Then he continued up the mountain with them because that was his job. It's hard not to respect people who do that for a living. Every trip up the mountain carries risks for them too, yet they keep going back to help other people reach the summit. They reached the summit at 10:50 a.m. Both men were exhausted in a way that was categorically different from any exhaustion either of them had experienced before. Not muscular, not cardiovascular, but a deep systemic depletion that made every movement require a separate, conscious decision. The wind had picked up noticeably in the last hour of the ascent. The sky to the west had changed. They had made it to the highest point on Earth. The descent began at 11:10 a.m. By the time they reached the section just below the summit, the wind had strengthened to the point where forward movement required active bracing. The incoming system was arriving ahead of schedule. Phelan's movement had become imprecise in a way that was no longer subtle. He was placing his feet on the fixed rope sections with a delay between intention and action that indicated his brain was not receiving adequate oxygen. On a ridge with significant exposure on both sides, that delay was dangerous in a specific and measurable way. Their lead Sherpa stayed within arm's reach of Phelan. The second Sherpa stayed close to Emmerich. The group was moving, but the pace was slower than the descent required, given what was building from the west. At approximately 1:20 p.m., at roughly 8,600 meters on the descent ridge below the south summit, Phelan stopped moving. He sat down on the ridge without warning, not a fall, just a cessation of forward movement. He said he needed a minute. His oxygen mask was still on, but his second bottle had been running longer than calculated due to the extended time above 8,000 meters, and the reserve was lower than it should have been. At that point in the descent, the lead Sherpa checked the gauge and switched him to the emergency bottle, the last one. He tried to get Phelan to stand. Phelan could not coordinate his legs well enough to stand safely on the ridge. His responses to instructions were present, but delayed by several seconds. His eyes were open, but not tracking normally. This was not exhaustion. This was high-altitude cerebral edema, the brain swelling that occurs when the body can no longer compensate for oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude, and it had been developing since at least the balcony, possibly earlier. The headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation had been the first signal. The slow pace, the imprecise footwork, the delayed responses on the ascent. All of it had been the progression of a process that Phelan's body had been fighting since before the summit push began. At 8,600 meters in a deteriorating storm, there was no treatment available and no way to descend fast enough to reverse it. Emmerich came back up to them. The wind was now strong enough that standing required active effort. The temperature had dropped sharply and visibility was beginning to close. The lead Sherpa told Emmerich directly that Phelan needed to be physically assisted down, and that doing so was going to require both Sherpas working together, which meant Emmerich needed to move independently for a section of the descent, staying on the fixed rope and moving as quickly as he could toward Camp 4. He made it approximately 200 meters further along the descent ridge before he also stopped. The hours above 8,000 meters, the oxygen depletion, the physical exertion of the ascent, and the beginning of the descent, and the cold had accumulated past the point his body could compensate for. He sat down on the ridge. He was conscious, more so than Phelan had been, but he could not stand. His hands were not responding with the precision required to manage the fixed rope safely. The lead Sherpa reached him after leaving Phelan with the second Sherpa. The wind was now at full storm intensity. Visibility had dropped to near zero. The temperature at that elevation with wind chill was approximately negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The lead Sherpa administered the last of the emergency oxygen supply to Emmerich. He stayed with him and attempted to get him moving for as long as conditions allowed. Emmerich was responsive to physical prompting, but could not sustain coordinated movement for more than a few steps before stopping again. Above them, the second Sherpa was in the same situation with Phelan, present, attempting to assist, unable to move a person who could not move themselves on a technical ridge in a whiteout storm at 8,600 meters. Radio contact with Camp 4 was established at approximately 2:15 p.m. A rescue from below was not possible. No one could ascend into those conditions to reach them. The team at Camp 4 could only maintain radio contact and wait. At some point in the following hours, radio contact with both men was lost. The lead Sherpa made it back to Camp 4 alone in the early hours of May 18th, severely depleted, with frostbite to 3 fingers on his left hand. The second Sherpa reached Camp 4 approximately 90 minutes later, also alone. When conditions allowed a search 2 days after the storm cleared, a team ascended the descent ridge from Camp 4. No trace of either man was found between the South Col and the South Summit. The search was called after 2 days without findings. The expedition operator's report documented the full timeline: departure from Camp 4, pace through each section, oxygen consumption rates, the turnaround recommendation at the South Summit, the decision to continue, and the lead Sherpa's account of the collapse and the conditions during the descent. A GPS device recovered from Camp 4 had logged the ascent track. The last recorded position was at approximately 8,590 meters at 1:47 p.m. on May 18th, consistent with the lead Sherpa's account of where Emmerich had stopped on the descent ridge. The coroner's determination, issued through the relevant Nepalese authorities, listed both Emmerich Pendleton and Phelan Thaddeus as presumed dead. Cause of death was listed as exposure and hypoxia, consistent with prolonged time in the death zone above 8,500 meters during deteriorating weather conditions. Contributing factors included oxygen reserves depleted beyond planned levels due to extended time above 8,000 meters, failure to initiate descent at the recommended turnaround point, and in Phelan Thaddeus's case, pre-existing signs of altitude-related cerebral stress that had been present since the second acclimatization rotation and had not been adequately addressed before the summit push. For a few minutes that morning, they stood on top of the world. In the end, neither Emmerich Pendleton nor Phelan Thaddeus was ever seen again.